happy to be up here, and thank you so much, Corey, for a really wonderful and full talk. Much to discuss there about Pushkin and Robeson. And as I say, I wish I had some images to show. They were really, really so helpful in helping us get to your points. But I'm a chalk and talk girl, so I'm sorry I don't have any, or some sound, as we heard yesterday from Susan. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and I thank the two Susans so much for inviting me to join the party. I thank particularly Susan Robeson for all that she's done to preserve her father's legacy, of which this is certainly so much of a part. And it's also good to be in the company of scholars whose work I've admired for so long, Nell and Penny, and also to be here with my good and old and dear friend, Albie and Vanessa. So my comments are necessarily personal because I lived through the 1950s as a young woman, a young girl, really. And my father was involved in Robeson's life through the 1950s, and my parents, both of my parents, my mother and my father, were friends of the Robesons through the 1940s, 50s, and on to the 60s. So I knew him as a girl. I told Susan the other day that on one occasion when my father, who grew up in Harlem, was visiting his parents there, he had Paul as a guest, and in preparation for Paul's visit, my father quickly taught me a few Chinese characters, which I wrote out and displayed to Paul, and he them beautifully for me, and then wrote a lovely note at the bottom, which I still have, and will turn over to Susan for the Robeson collection. So, as I say, personal, and therefore, I'm speaking obviously as a scholar, but I will leave it to others to be far more critical, perhaps, and to lift up shortcomings that prevailed during this period and that characterized the work of the folks that I'm about to speak about. I just want to say a few words about the importance of their work for the long internationalist struggle against racism. 5 years from the years 1950 to 1955, the newspaper / magazine Freedom was published. It was published out of Harlem, and it was called Paul Robeson's Newspapers. As well, before that, in the years 1937 to 1946, a magazine called The Cavalcade was published by the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And after Freedom was forced to close from bankruptcy in 1955, a successor would emerge years later in 1961 called Freedom Ways. And many of the editors and writers and readers of Cavalcade, Freedom, and Freedom Ways can be identified across these really 3 or 4 generations. Together, these publications kept Black progressive internationalist ideas, analysis, tradition, and cultural and political products alive, vibrant, and circulating for, as I say, 3 or 4 decades. They form a spine of sorts, a spine that runs along the larger project of Black progressive internationalist politics, with which Marxists and non-Marxists alike were aligned. The publications were squarely situated within the Black journalism tradition, which is to say that they represented writing by African Americans for a primarily African American audience. The political and cultural products that they reflected were the values of all those who participated in these products: the readers, the editors, the journalists, and the artists, the visual artists who participated in these three publications. They created and reflected a discrete community, and they offered to users outside of those communities access to their thought and to their politics, but on the terms set by the creators themselves. Each publication, in its own way, embraced the organizing principles of the Popular Front, while asserting and protecting a distinct autonomy resting on the cultural and political practices of Afro-descended peoples. They were at once the producers as well as the reporters of a Black progressive agenda, and they saw no contradiction in this binary, that they were both participating as well as reporting on these events. Their comparators, in some way their competitors, mentioned earlier by Corey, the Baltimore Afro-American, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, were in conversation with these socialist and progressive publications. And they were as well in conversation with their white Marxist left publications, Masses and Mainstream, which was published between 1948 and 1963, Political Affairs, and then later the National Guardian. These three publications about which I will speak distinguished themselves from others by their common features. They were grounded in the domestic fight for Black liberation. They were explicitly internationalists. They prioritized labor rights, and they embraced a womanist, feminist agenda. Much could be said about freedom. I want to say a few words about how freedom got its start, and then I want to focus on two particular aspects of its product, its cultural product, and then its relationship to legal matters. So freedom was launched to, as we know, to support the fight for Paul's passport and to give him a platform by which he could still reach his extraordinarily large audience in 1950. Now, that fact alone is worth pondering for a moment, that here it was in 1950, Paul Robeson, citizen of the world, one of the most famous Americans, here at the top of his career, in the very middle of the century, 1950, as one journalist put it, the best known American in the world, that Paul Robeson, the world's moral voice, its spiritual voice, and its musical and lyrical voice, had to rely on a small publication out of Harlem, New York, to get his message to the world. That alone, my dear friends, brothers, sisters, and comrades, is worth pondering. Paul Robeson published a piece in every issue of Freedom, which he titled, "Here's My Story." And there he set out his views on the labor movement, on the Korean War, and of course on the passport fight and the fight to free the Smith Act victims. As well, of course, he addressed matters of local significance, mostly matters having to do with New York politics. He did not say enough about Harlem, and many critics of the newspaper complained about that. But he had much to say about anti-colonial movements in Asia and in Africa and in the Caribbean. So how did all this start? Step down from my pedestal for a moment. In November of 1950, Robeson, Louis Burnham, Esther Jackson, Herbert Atticker, and others formed the Freedom Fund, the announced purpose of which was to allocate resources to projects that would encourage and support the full and equal citizenship status of U.S. Negroes, unquote. Freedom was as far as I know, the only product of the Freedom Fund, and it immediately got to work to launch the newspaper. George Murphy, who was the nephew of Carl Murphy, the longtime editor of the Baltimore Afro-American, would become the business manager of the newspaper, and my father would become its editor, and of course, Paul was its raison d'etre, and as well a major editor. My father, along with Esther Cooper Jackson, had been active in the Southern leaders of the Southern Negro Youth Congress previously. And after he was expelled from Birmingham, Alabama by Bull Connor in 1949, he returned to his native town, New York City, looked around for work, was approached by Apteker and others, including Esther, and then launched Freedom. It set up its offices on 125th Street in Harlem. It was to be a voice of Harlem and from Harlem. And there it shared space with the Council on African Affairs, which was then directed by Alpheus Hunton, who was Robeson's friend and contemporary, and the Civil Rights Congress, formed in 1946 under the leadership of William Patterson. Patterson was likely at that time in 1950 working on We Charge Genocide, which would be presented to the United States by Paul Robeson in New York and by Patterson in Paris in 1951. Lorraine Hansberry came to the newspaper in 1950. She was 21 years old, and she would later describe it as a tight and busy and noisy, bustling, urgent, and comfortable space. She once wrote that when she got there, she found, quote, a somewhat bare and barren Harlem office furnished with 2 desks, 1 typewriter, and a remarkably enthusiastic working staff of 2. She also observed that she was oftentimes the males around her couldn't figure out whether she was the gal Friday or the writer. During this period of time, Lorraine published a number of poems, but she didn't publish them in Freedom. She did write for Freedom, but she published her poems in Masses and Mainstream. And my guess is that they paid her and Freedom did not. A host of other writers and artists appeared in Freedom's pages and in its offices, including Lloyd Brown, whose novel Iron City was published in 1951, that a prison novel, an early prison novel, based on Lloyd's own experiences as a labor organizer and political prisoner in Pittsburgh in the late 1930s. Lloyd was close to Paul Robeson, and it is said helped him write his columns for Freedom. As well, the writer Alice Childress, the cartoonist Ollie Harrington, who also published his work in the Pittsburgh Courier, double duty there, and Islander as well, wrote about developments in the United States, in China, and in Africa. Islander Robeson once wrote in celebration of the Chinese Revolution in the pages of Freedom, quote, nobody gave China back to the Chinese people. They had to fight to get it back. So, said succinctly and crisply and firmly as SC always did. Augustus Strong also wrote for the newspaper, and as did many, many others. So let me say a few words about Freedom as a cultural product. What rendered it distinct from other African American publications was not just its progressive political agenda, internationalist political agenda, but that it pursued deliberately a Black liberation culture. And in this sense, the newspaper mirrored Robeson's own representation of the seamless relationship between political culture and Black culture. Freedom readers could eavesdrop on Alice Childress's maid talking to her friend about life in a Black house, in a white household as a white maid. They could enjoy cartoons by Ollie Harrington, who himself was an internationalist, Charles White, and many others who participated in this early project. Its cultural work was not limited to the print product, however, because there was a mutually reinforcing relationship between what the newspaper presented in print and the activities, particularly those of Paul Robeson, that it supported on the outside, his concerts, his speeches. And we know from having heard them yesterday that it wasn't only his musical voice, which was a cultural product, it was as well his speaking voice, the speeches that he gave all across the world. The paper was constantly on the verge of financial collapse. And my father spent more time raising money to support the next edition of the paper than he did writing for the paper. But Paul's support was critical and was the only way, really. I don't know where the Soviet rubles were when Freedom was being published. They certainly never arrived on 125th Street. But Paul's support was certainly critical to the 5 years of the paper's existence. He would perform at concerts in Harlem in support of freedom, and the Freedom family, as George Murphy would call it, would come really from all parts of the Northeast to attend Paul's concerts. The concerts themselves would be 25 cents, but the participants would also have to pay a dollar, I believe it was $1, for subscription to Freedom. It never raised its price. Its price was always $1. That was that sustained, or did not sustain it, but the price was sustained across the 5 years of Freedom's existence. Now, although Robeson was at the time the world's best loved and most effective internationalist, famously comfortable, as we've heard and will hear here, with Welsh miners and workers in China and across the world. One could say that the cultural orientation of Freedom was Afrocentric, placing African American ideals, histories, and sensibilities at the center of its analysis and its representation. It interrogated, entitled, expounded upon, and defended the intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic particularity of Black American ways of living in a way that distinguished it from its contemporary and competitive publications. And it extracted from this cultural output the possibilities for a reordered politic. It was an enactment of Du Bois's plaintiff reference in Souls of Black Folk, as much as it was an ongoing Harlem Renaissance. And it was a sketching out of the actual length of the long arc of the moral universe. It was a cultural world divorced from, and in a real sense opposed to, the commercial value and corporate exploitation of Black culture. And in that sense, it can be contrasted with what in the current moment passes for Black American culture. And its idiom was, as I say, rooted in the Black experience, but its cultural product was seen through a far wider lens, through which it acknowledged the racial injustice that was experienced outside of the United States, and through which it commented on political events like the ongoing war in Korea, events in China, and of course, in South Africa. Freedom also avoided fetishizing Black exceptionalism. All apologies to those who love Pushkin and Robeson. In the manner of magazines like Jet and Ebony, who held up Black heroes through a particular lens. Recent commentators have complained that, as I say, there was very little coverage of Harlem itself. There was not much of the of the moment news in Freedom. It left all that material for others to cover, but it did cover Black sports. It didn't cover the sororities, the Divine Nine, Black sorority life, or fraternity life. It left all that to others. Its cultural product, in sum, was purposeful and purposefully aligned with Robeson's own views that art could uplift and unite the oppressed and the voiceless. Now I want to say a few words about Freedom and its focus on cases of illegal lynching and legal and illegal lynching, and its defense of those assailed by Marxism, by anti-communism. Freedom was very effective in linking what today we would call the excesses of the carceral state with the civil liberties fights that were waged to protect Marxists, communists, socialists, and other dissenters from the onslaught of McCarthyism. Its pages explored and complemented the compilation that Bill Patterson and others had presented in 1951, We Charge Genocide. And it featured stories on the cases that Patterson's Civil Rights Congress was defending. I will say parenthetically that those of us, and I count myself among them, who are working in this material today and who are seeking to unearth the facts of many of these cases, find that the CRC's reporting was oftentimes inaccurate and sometimes sloppy, but that could be true because those who ran the CRC did not have either the training or the resources that those who were working in the same space that the NAACP did to lift up these cases and properly prosecute them. Freedom was first published towards the end of the campaign on behalf of Willie McGee. That was a case that was taken up by Patterson in the 1940s. McGee was charged in 1945 with a capital crime of rape and executed in 1951, which is a year after Freedom's launch. At the time of his execution, Lorraine Hansberry, who was working for the paper, told her biographer that the McGee execution, quote unquote, haunted her pen. And she would later write a poem in honor of Rosa Lee Ingram, another case lifted up by Freedom that also discussed the McGee matter. It was a praise song both to Ingram and to McGee. Shirley Graham Du Bois also wrote a piece about the McGee case, declaring, oh no, before his execution, no one is going to forget about Willie McGee. The typical lynch law cases covered by Freedom often appeared close to its coverage of the McCarthy era cases. For example, in the March 1951 issue of the paper, the front page lead headline reads, "Stop Murder of Innocents, Save Willie McGee," with a plea to readers to write and advocate and meet to defend Willie McGee. Right next to that story is an article by Paul Robeson titled "Set Him Free to Labor On," a tribute to W.E.B. Du Bois. Here, Robeson condemns, of course, the federal indictment of Du Bois that came in 1951, charged him with being the agent of a foreign power because of his signature on the Stockholm Peace Petition. Ben Davis, in the same paper, writes about his prosecution and the prosecution of other SMCBAC defendants under the caption, "Why Do Communist Leaders Face Jail?" The Davis piece outlined the charges against himself, but also references the Martinsville 7, the McGee case, the Trenton, New Jersey 6, and many other cases that were being prosecuted and publicized by the Freedom newspaper and the CRC. And hence the paper articulated what its readers well knew about how criminal policies racializing African American identity were linked in the fight for political rights linked in the fight for political rights. The paper tied both of these claims together and observed that they were both about human rights and thereby internationalized both sets of claims. In that sense, the paper built on the arguments that Patterson had laid out in We Charge Genocide about the importance of the newly emerging human rights regime to realities faced in the United States with respect to day-to-day criminalization of African American life and the McCarthy attacks on the leaders of the CPUSA and other groups. So here I argue, and I include this in my longer paper, but will summarize here to say that Freedom's work in this regard was a forerunner of later campaigns that coupled domestic and international rights. And here I reference an effort by Chicago activists in 2014, calling themselves We Charge Genocide, and appearing before the UN Committee Against Torture to advocate for those who endured torture at the hands of the Chicago police over a series of decades in the late 20th century. They are clearly walking the path that was first tread by Robeson, Patterson, and all of those who created freedom. Let me just say a few words about Cavalcade and a few words about Freedom Ways, and then I will conclude. As I said earlier, Cavalcade was the magazine of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. It was edited by Augusta Jackson Strong, the wife of the communist leader Ed Strong, and Augusta would later become an important editor as well of Freedom Ways magazine, first started in 1961. Cavalcade, too, included not just political commentary, but most importantly, and at that point, Cavalcade is focused on events in the South, Southern Negro Youth Congress. It's not a national publication, but obviously meant to reach its supporters outside of the South, but focusing on the concerns of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, namely voting, criminal justice issues, and the rights of veterans. But again, with very rich and important artistic expression and representation in Cavalcade. And so, as I say, Freedom closes its doors in 1955, leaving its employees, including my father, the supporter of 4 children, without work. My dad went to work for a number of years at the National Guardian. Thanks very much to the editors of that newspaper for taking him on. And then he passed away precipitously in 1960. In 1961, his colleagues, Esther Jackson, Augusta Strong, Herbert Attaker, and others all came together and determined that the tradition of freedom and of Cavalcade needed to be rebirthed in a new publication, and hence was born Freedom Ways magazine. Esther Jackson would remark when asked why she started Freedom, she said, "We were a group of friends," or who started Freedom? "We were a group of friends involved in the Southern Negro Youth Congress." She chose Harlem to locate its as the anchor for Freedom Ways, as it had been the anchor for freedom itself, because there was a vibrant, progressive community of organizers, entertainers, artists, and intellectuals moving forward from the Harlem Renaissance through the 1940s and on into the 60s, 50s and 60s, still in Harlem. Harlem was still the home, the literary home of Africa America. And so there in Harlem, Freedom Ways was close to the Robesons and the Du Boises, who were still, obviously, the leaders and intellectual giants of this particular community. Esther described the formation of Freedom Ways in this way. She said, "After Louis Burnham died, we were all in such shock that nothing happened for a while. And then Jim Jackson, that was her husband, a member of the CPUSA, as was Esther Jackson, until perhaps in the 1960s when she begins to move away from the party and chart her own course, which involved the support and launching of freedom." She says, Jim Jackson, Shirley Graham Du Bois, Dr. Du Bois, John Oliver Killens, Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis, Lorraine Hensbury, and others of us got together. We were trying to figure it out because this was Louis Burnham's dream. I agreed to work for a year to try to raise funds to find an office. Dr. Du Bois advised us from his experiences with the crisis that we should not get out our first issue until we had enough money in the bank for at least a year or two, which they did. So from its inception, the editors of Freedom Ways, which included Esther, John Henrik Clark, Augusta Strong, were committed to a broad-based, non-sectarian publication that would be attractive to a wide range of thinkers and writers and readers. In its first volume, published in 1961, the editors announced, "Freedom Ways will explore without prejudice or gag," whatever that is, "and from the viewpoint of the special interests of American Negroes, as well as the general interest of the nation, the new forms of economic, political, and social systems now existing or emerging in the world." In other words, it would embrace a non-sectarian, big tent internationalist perspective on Black life. She wanted to reach the maximum, she said, the maximum numbers of people. In other words, in contrast, perhaps to freedom, but especially in contrast to political affairs, Masses and Mainstream, The Daily Worker, which were organs of the CPUSA, Freedom Ways was launched with a view that it would carry over the work of this group of activists from the 1930s and 40s into the 1960s, and we all know that the world, at least our world in the United States, blew up in the 1960s. They wanted to be a part of that. They wanted to be advisors to that. They wanted to be recorders of all of that. And for that, they needed explicitly to be as broad and as sectarian as they could be. Its readership and its publications were marvelous. And I say that in contrast to what Freedom was able to do in the time of its existence. It was able to, Freedom Ways was, and I say that also to honor Esther Jackson's formidable skills as an organizer, as a writer, as an editor, as someone who could reach out as easily to Langston Hughes, as to Walter White, as to John Lewis, as to James Baldwin, all of whom appeared in the pages of her magazine, Freedom Ways magazine. As I say, the paper covered, was around for 15 years, and therefore had a huge impact on were there other Black publications at the time? Of course there were. Tom Dent had a publication. Of course, the newspapers were still active. But Freedom Ways provided a very special vehicle for those who identified themselves as associated with internationalism, universalism, progressivism, and integrationism, radical integrationism. And in that respect, I think some have commented and criticized Freedom in that it was not as open, that its pages were not as open to thought leaders, as they say today, like Malcolm X and others who were nationalists in their thinking and who perhaps, and whose politics perhaps did not align as Esther Jackson and others might have wanted them to. So it's non-sectarian, but perhaps with a comma. So again, Paul Robeson is critical to the success of Freedom Ways magazine. There are many articles about him and his work in the magazine, and as well. And perhaps most significantly, again, he contributes by singing and performing to raise money for Freedom Ways. After Paul returns to the United States in 1963, Esther Jackson approaches him and his wife, Eslanda, to inquire whether Freedom Ways can salute him. And so they did. They organized a huge tribute to Paul Robeson, which was in 1965 in New York City. Attending were figures across the artistic and political spectrum, reflecting Paul's reach, but also by now Freedom Ways' reach. So including James Baldwin, John Lewis, Herbert Aptaker, John Coltrane, Dizzy Gillespie, Bill Taylor, Dick Gregory, Diane Sands, all of these appeared at this wonderful event for Paul, celebrating his return to the U.S., if not his full-fledged return to the career he had enjoyed before he was hounded out of it. Greetings at that event came in from all over the world. Nehru, Shirley Graham Du Bois, and Alpheus Hunton, who at that time were in Ghana, sent their greetings, the Moscow Art Theater, and scores of others. It was a striking array of voices, some progressive, some not, and it was this broad mix of artists and activists who were freedom's audience and its creators. It made clear that despite the devastating assault of McCarthyism, these activists had, by dint of I don't know what, remained alive and with voice across the 50s and 60s, and that their leadership in the person of Dr. Du Bois and Shirley Graham and Paul Robeson and Essie Robeson, that they too had survived and that they had had their influence across the 1960s and into the 1970s. I'm going to close now, but before I do, let me say that this has really given me a wonderful opportunity to rethink my father's contribution to this period. And what I want to say here is that in doing so, I reached out to a historian who works with me. He's in Washington, but he works with our project. And he's been moving his way through the files of the War Department. And so when I got this invitation, I asked him to go through those files and see if he could find anything about SNYC and Louis Burnham. And I must get something from him every week. And I want to just say, if they walked to the store to buy a quart of milk, they were followed. They were followed. Every step they took, they were followed. And those documents are still available to us. And perhaps some of this they knew and some of it they didn't know. But they prevailed. Thank you very much.
The floor is open for questions. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Margaret. You've taught me a lot about my own youth, actually, because in the Bay Area, I grew up reading those magazines, Freedom and Freedom Ways. And when I talk to other African Americans from the 20th century, I feel inauthentically Black because we did not subscribe to JET. We were more serious in ways that you have explained. So thank you very much for helping me to understand my own background.
Thank you.
Susan?
Yes, I want to thank you as well. It was both very informative but also very moving talk. Thank you. You mentioned that at a certain point the freedom's concerns, unlike, I guess, Jet, were in line with Robeson's, the subjects that were discussed. Do you know how much of a role he played editorially?
Do you want to?
Do you want multiple questions?
No. I'll. Yes. So he had a
the
column.
next question was Susan Robeson.
He had a column that appeared in every issue of the newspaper. It was called Paul's paper. He was an editor, and he obviously didn't. He was as busy in the 1950s, from 1955 to 1950, 1955, as he had been when he responded to Walter White and to Du Bois about the Pushkin article. But he nevertheless reviewed everything or pretty much everything that went into the paper. My father was in close contact with him over those years. As I said, they would meet in Harlem. He would go to the office. Robeson would go to the office from time to time, and then they would have these Saturday meetings, at which I assume they would talk about how were they going to find the money for the next issue, or what was going to be in the next issue, or that sort of thing.
And what was the circulation, roughly?
Oh, that I don't know.
Susan Robeson.
Yeah, I know also there was a huge distribution, like grassroots distribution all across the country of freedom.
It's on, yeah.
Yeah, which was a huge part of it. It was like organizing and getting the word out and stuff. So, and they came under attack. I think that was also part of it. The distribution network could not survive anymore. The assault of the FBI locally against them was a big factor, as I
Well, no, that's
understood it.
absolutely right. And some subscribers would report that they would get visits from the FBI for being subscribers. So, it was a daunting, getting the newspaper out, publishing the newspaper, finding its readership. It was a daunting project. And they didn't have any, they had some, but not much advertising. They didn't cover, as I said, the things that the other black press covered that, made them attractive to households, like who got married or who died or any of that sort of thing. And right, and they weren't able to circulate at the newsstands, which was the way newspapers were sold back then. So those things were all large impediments to circulating the magazine. Freedom Ways was able to overcome that, in part because it was literally a magazine as opposed to a newspaper, and so you thought you were getting a fuller product. It was more expensive, and there was more. There was poetry. There was stuff that someone who really didn't want to know about what was going on in Indonesia, but might want to read a Tom Dent poem, could get in Freedom Ways.
Penny, and then...
Yeah, what I wanted, and thank you, Margaret. I mean, for me, like, getting back to you it's just beautiful because there's not many of us left, and roots. So thank you. What I've been thinking about, because people ask me, and so are there legal issues that would merit any kind of suit or legal case against whomever related to Paul that would have standing today? And you may not have the answer, but it's something
This is
that,
like the person who comes up to you at the cocktail party and knows you're a lawyer and says, my lease, can you help me with my... I'm sorry.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Go
So
ahead.
and maybe not for now, but I feel like I need to explore those things.
I agree.
At some point, because if not, who and when. So maybe that's just out there.
No, for
over
sure.
time, how to go about that. And is it a waste of time? And where might some of the avenues be if they exist? So it may not.
We will talk later.
Yeah,
We will talk later, but let me just say quickly, and Albie can pipe in here. The statute limits anything you can do in a court, but there are proceedings that could be engaged that might be remunerative, that might give some possibilities that would not require you to file a lawsuit.
Yeah, I don't know the right term. Just because I think of the educational value of them in terms of bringing alive again, keeping alive what has happened and bringing it to the fore, naming the issues. And thank you.
Go on.
Yeah, well, first, just a deep thank you, just profoundly moving and like tears in the eyes. And I hope this is a book. That's what I want to say. And
You never want to write a book about a parent.
I don't know. Yeah. Okay. So it's just a couple of quick comments. I loved your sense of a big tent, and I was wondering if you had more thoughts about that. Years ago, I was able to interview Lloyd Brown, and I was asking him about Walter White's betrayal of the left, and it was so funny because Lloyd Brown said, Walter, like he was no rebel. We didn't expect anything else of him. And so I was struck that he was, back writing in Freedom Way. So just that kind of big tent of a group of people who were not trying to be a black middle class corporate body, but really remake the world in the image of their values informed by this deep African American history. So I really loved your discussion of that. And just, I don't know if you can talk more about the War Department, the different kinds of sources you're getting on surveillance, and speaking to Susan's point, because it's so enormous. And I think there has to be much more of a collective effort to document that history and do it in a way, collective, because it's too much. It's just too much for any one or small group of people because, but it really does need to be documented, and thank you for that part of the story.
So on the big tent, there are many people who could be credited with moving to that space. And it was a movement, I think, to that space. I think, the crumbs are there in the 1950s, but it comes full bloom really in the 1960s, this idea that in part, I will say that Esther Jackson did have to move away from the party in order to be able to have this different vision, both to have and to realize a different vision. It is true that the party was obviously, and there are people in this room who know more about this than I do. I'm not a student of the party. That was a different organ in 1960s. It was torn by factionalism and heightened hyper-sectarianism than it was in the 1940s and 1950s. Her husband stayed with the party. Jim Jackson stayed and decided that's where he was going to set his feet, and he stayed with it, and Marxist through and through until the very end, not just a Marxist, but a practicing Marxist and a critical Marxist. She moved away from that. And it was that shift that allowed her to create something quite different and allowed her to have connections with folks who, either because they were afraid of being red-baited, which everyone was at that point, or because of their own predispositions, didn't want to have relationships with people who had been associated, affiliated, or members of the party. And so that really gave her the space. What I will also say is that, you always want to try to imagine what would the world be like without. And if we think about what the world would be, what the world of this black left would be without its giants, which were Robeson and Du Bois, it would be an enormously diminished world, and it might never have had the kind of effect and impact that it had on later movements without those voices. And I try in my talk, I try to illustrate that by showing how important it was that Robeson was always willing to come out and be there and bring his audience and enlarge his audience. Yeah.
So there are two more questions. I'll take Corey and then Victor.
Okay. Margaret, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I find a lot actually in common with our talks. Of course, there are the sort of overlapping figures, but I think it also speaks to thing that you just touched on, which are these blurred lines with these publications, right? I mean, so that I love Nell's example, but then I was also thinking the people who are writing for these places, they're really not purists. You know, they have Jet on the table, they have Ebony, they have Freedom Ways. I think about someone like Lorraine Hansberry, and they're reading everything. They're reading absolutely everything, right? The Time, like, so I think that's something to sort of just contend with, even when we think about sort of literary genre as well, right? You can't do everything, but people were kind of getting everything. I entirely respect not writing a book that you're not planning on writing. One of the things that, is so striking about what you're saying is, rather than thinking about deficits, we're thinking about sort of this rich intellectual life that has manifestation in print. So that I'm just curious, what are you reading? I mean, are there scholars that you think are doing a particularly good job at getting at some of these histories that you might point us to?
Well,
because obviously you're working on stuff, but I'm wondering, are people starting to get the story right? You're getting the story right, and you might not capture it now, but are people doing that work? Thank you.
I think
again.
people are doing that work, and here I think Penny's work has been, has provided much of a foundation and a jumping off point. Beyondi's work is obviously Kelly out in California. So this stuff is continuing to be mined and refined. As I was thinking about this paper for today, you go out there, you see there are a series of new PhDs who are writing in the area. There's still a lot to do, and I don't think we don't have the whole story. And this goes to Penny's point. It's shameful that we will have to go to the belly of the beast, inside the belly of the beast, to find out what our folks did, on June 12th of 1946. But that's where the material is. It's the raw material. So on top of that, you need people who are really well trained, widely read, and with the right perspective. And so some folks who are out there do have all those. I think Penny and Robin, and I like Gerald Horne's work. Gerald is great for collecting every fact in the world. But yeah, so there are people who are doing the work.
Victor.
Yes, a few notes. I thought maybe for tomorrow for mine, but they fit in now. First of all, about Freedom Ways, evidently it also had humor occasionally. I know because of Ollie Harrington's description in Freedom Ways of the raid of the police against a torchlight parade in Harlem, a demonstration where they made a mistake and went by horseback. And when those torches hit the backsides of the horses, he said they outdid the Kentucky Derby running to the Central Park Lake. And Harrington describes it so beautifully, but also describes in an interesting article life of the exile expats in Paris, including himself, including Richard Wright. Harrington believes that Richard Wright was murdered by the CIA. He describes that in Freedom Ways, I believe. And a last note, somewhat personal, a group of Americans came to the World Youth Festival in East Berlin in 1973, and it included quite a number of Black Americans and Native Americans. And one of the Black Americans, I think she was a journalist from Freedom Ways, but I don't remember her name.
Could well be. Thank you for that, Victor.
It wasn't not Lorraine, of course.
No.
But
I will try to figure out who that was.
She spoke to me and she said, our group, some of them say they wish they could stay here in the GDR. And I told her, I said, as a delegation here, of course, you're not being shown the problems so much. You're being shown the icing and the pretty side of it. Do you know that young people have lots of problems here and they're angry about many things, from not traveling and various things. And I described some of these problems, and I will never forget, she looked at me with big eyes, interrupted by children wanting autographs from her, but she was looking at me with big eyes and saying, you don't seem to understand. With us, it's a question of surviving. And I would never forget that.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
So we can break now for 10 minutes and reconvene soon. Thank you very much for that.